Hello, Fearless Gamers, Matt here for Fearless Games, and welcome to How to Play Battlefleet Gothic Remastered Part 4-B. Before we start this video, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. That way you know when more of these videos come out. Hit that little bell icon so YouTube actually tells you when these videos come out. And give this video a like. That way it gets out there and circulates more. And I can also see what content you guys really want to see. This helps me out greatly with deciding what kind of video content to give to you guys. And like I said, it helps out the channel a lot. And we really appreciate it if you could do that. So, with that out of the way, let's continue with the video. So in our last video, we went over the Ordnance phase and broke it down as to how it operates, how you launch Ordnance, move Ordnance, how vessels can defend against Ordnance. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the different types of Ordnance there are in the game and all the special rules they have. This is a pretty meaty video, so sit back and relax and let's dive right in. So the first type of ordnance we're going to discuss is torpedoes. This is the classic ordnance that you're going to find. Pretty much any army typically has at least one ship that can fire torpedoes. These are these giant skyscraper-sized tubes that have giant engines on them filled with massive explosives, and when they go and they hit something, they cause massive damage. And in the game, they are represented by a torpedo marker, which looks like this. Now the link in the description has a file that has the torpedo marker on it, and you're going to see multiple types of torpedoes on there. One that's 2, 3, 6, and all that fun stuff. In Battlefleet Gothic Remastered, only the 3-prong torpedo marker matters. Officially, if you want to use a different marker than the one that GW provides or anything like that, you need to find the maximum width that the marker can be is 2.5 centimeters. So it doesn't matter what the token looks like as long as its width is 2.5 centimeters. And the reason for this is just to make it a little simpler. There's less crowding on the board, and it's easier to mainstream this system. So what you would do when you're firing your torpedoes, you'd place your torpedo marker down and put a D6 next to it representing the strength of the torpedo salvo, which you'll find on your ship's datasheet. You then move them their maximum distance, and any ship that comes into contact with the token as it makes its way to its endpoint gets attacked by the salvo. And each point of strength that the torpedo salvo has, that's 1d6 you get to roll to attack the vessel. You would roll it, and any die that equals or greater than the ship's armor value is a direct hit and does damage to the vessel. Any attacks that miss continue on down its path. So if you have a torpedo salvo strength of 6 and you hit the vessel and 3 make it through and 3 miss, and the next ones and the salvo continues on its way, it now has a strength value of 3. So the next ship that it comes in contact with would you would roll 3d6. And when it's done with its movement, you would place down the marker at the point of its final movement with a die with the updated strength value of the salvo. So like here we go in this example, Gothic class cruiser, it's got a torpedo value of 6, and it's got 2 chaos vessels in its way that are within range of those salvos. So he fires and moves them forward and attacks the first vessel. The strength of the salvo is 6, so he gets to roll 3d6. The armor value is 5, so any roll of a 5 or greater is a hit. This chaos vessel gets hit 3 times by the torpedo salvo, reducing the strength of the salvo down to 3. It then continues its move and makes contact with the second chaos vessel. We roll again, this time only 3d6 because that's the strength of the salvo, and it rolls 2 hits. So now the strength of the salvo is reduced by 1, and it continues its movement to its final position with a die representing the strength value, which is 1. There is a chance for torpedoes to prematurely detonate before they get anywhere on the field. This can happen by the following scenarios. When it passes over a blast marker, you roll a d6 and the result is 6. That destroys the whole salvo. If it gets hit by a direct fire attack, that destroys the whole salvo. And if it comes in contact with enemy attack craft, that removes the salvo. Or if it hits another torpedo salvo, that will destroy them. In scenarios where the ships gets hit by torpedoes and the torpedoes run out of movement, so they end their move in base contact with the ship, that ship doesn't get attacked a second time in the subsequent turn. It's treated as if the torpedoes have moved past the vessel already, so it can safely move on without risk of getting hit by those torpedoes. However, if another vessel comes in contact with that ship and the torpedoes are touching the ship's base, then that other ship can get attacked by the torpedoes because they're a new target, so it's possible they get hit by the torpedoes. And when you initially fire torpedoes, they can only affect vessels in the ship's firing arc. And another important thing is torpedoes do not care if you're friend or foe. If they make base contact with a ship, doesn't matter which one it is, they attack automatically. The only way to avoid that is if ships are in base contact with a vessel that's firing torpedoes. Those are allowed to shoot past the ships because they're in base contact with each other. And of course, there are rules with squadrons with base contacts, which we'll get into when we go into the video about squadrons. Now, when ships have a torpedo value greater than 6, they're allowed to split fire their torpedoes, but they can't fire in the same direction. They have to go in 2 different directions, so you can't do 1 and then 1 to try for a double hit with torpedoes. And in cases of squadrons where they can combine their torpedo attacks when in base contact, they are not obligated to. So just because 2 vessels are in base contact with each other and they're squadroned doesn't mean they have to combine their torpedoes. You can fire them as separate salvos in 2 different directions. Another point note here is if a torpedo has the ability to re-roll its attacks, it must do so. Even if you get enough damage, even if you get enough successful hits to destroy the vessel without them, you have to re-roll the hits. It's unfortunate, but that's the rule. And torpedoes do not ignore hulks unless they're boarding torpedoes. Guided torpedoes can try and turn away from hulks, but with the exception of boarding torpedoes, any torpedoes that come in contact with a hulk, friend or foe, automatically attack it. And I say guided torpedoes because there are some torpedoes like TOW torpedoes that have the ability to make turns during their movement. It's typically a 45-degree turn, and this turn must happen before the torpedoes move, and it cannot happen on the turn that the torpedoes are fired. You do this by turning them by 45 degrees from the center of the turret's marker, and cannot make it where one edge of the torpedoes can travel further than its maximum distance. So this could potentially mean one side of the torpedo marker gets the inside of the turn, may not get to move a full 30 centimeters or 25 centimeters, whatever the torpedo's range is, because the outer edge turned too much and it would have making the one edge go 20 centimeters would make the other one end up going 25. That one's not really a totally big deal. I find as long as you turn its center drip and just move directly from the center, it should all be fine. Boarding torpedoes is another type of torpedo. This one is where they basically have a bunch of guys crammed inside of the torpedo and they're using it like a semi-guidable ship to get to where they're going. Because just like guided torpedoes, after their initial launch, they can make a 45-degree turn before they do their movement. When they come in contact with a vessel, they perform what's called a hit and run attack. Typically that happens in the end phase, so when we get to the end phase, we'll talk about that more. But boarding torpedoes are the exception. That hit and run attack is done during the ordnance phase. And if boarding torpedoes come in contact with any other type of torpedo other than a friendly boarding torpedo, they are removed automatically, just as if they were, so they treat them basically as enemy torpedoes. Because they combine with each other and explode, and it's horrible. And as mentioned before, boarding torpedoes do not attack friendly hulks and friendly vessels. They're able to guide them around those ships. So they're the only torpedoes in the game that aren't forced to attack friendly vessels. They can ignore them. The next type of ordnance is attack craft. Like torpedoes, there are various types of attack craft, and all of them follow the same general rules, and those are, when they are launched, the attacking player, the player that controls the ship, gets to decide what type of ordnance they're launching. The number of ordnance they're allowed to launch in a given turn is represented by their launch bay value. So if they have a launch bay value of 4, they can launch up to 4 different squadrons. And they can be a mix. They could do, if they have 4, they can do one assault boat, 1 fighter, and 2 bombers, or 2 bombers, 2 fighters. Whatever combination they want to do is up to them. When they are launched, they are allowed to move and turn freely as they see fit. They're essentially assumed to dip, dive, and turn as ever they feel like it. However, doesn't mean they're allowed to ignore any ordnance markers or ships that they come in contact with, just to get past them. The first valid target they come in contact with, they must attack. Even if another vessel is their primary target, if they somehow accidentally hit something else, be it another ordnance marker or another ship, then they have to affect it as if it was their intentional target. The only time they're allowed to ignore another vessel is if they're trying to go for a ship that's hiding in the wake of another ship. So if you have a battleship with a big 60mm base and there's a cruiser with its base overlapping that battleship, if the attack craft have enough distance to get to the ship that's hiding in the battleship's base, then it's allowed to ignore the battleship to attack the smaller ship. That's the only time that they can ignore a closer vessel that they come in contact with. And when it comes to assault boats, bombers, and whatnot, if they attack a vessel and the vessel is destroyed before applying the attacks of the entire wave, the whole wave is expended. It doesn't function like torpedoes, where if you blow up the vessel and you had 3 bombers that didn't get to attack, those 3 stick around. Unfortunately, they get removed from the table because the whole wave is expended. The first type of attack craft are fighters. Fighters are one-man, fast aircraft designed for intercepting other small aircraft. Think of them like Xiphon interceptors for Space Marines or Crimson Hunters for Eldari. Basically, think like that kind of ships. And their purpose is to basically defend against other ordnance types. So in the following situations, these effects happen. If the fighter marker comes into contact with any other ordnance, fighter, bomber, torpedo, what have you, they attack them and destroy it, removing both tokens from the field. Now, in scenarios where you have a attack craft that's a dual function fighter something else, like for example, a Thunderhawk is a fighter and an assault boat, you can't volunteer to have it choose not to be a fighter to avoid it attacking the ordnance token and stopping it from performing other functions. So if you have this multitask function thing, and it's in a scenario where the fighter side of its type would be triggered, you have to play it out. You can't just say, oh no, I choose not to use its fighter function. Its function is always on no matter what. And against enemy ships, their weaponry isn't strong enough to take any serious damage to their armor. So the vessels find no danger in them, and they won't bother attacking them with their turrets, and the ships themselves won't even bother trying to attack them because they can't do any damage. So in those cases, you just leave them where they are, and in the following phases, they move like nothing's going on. And another thing that fighters are capable of doing is called Combat Air Patrol, or CAP. This is essentially when they perform a protective escort around a vessel. And this is done when they come into base contact with a ship, or when they're launched, you declare that they're going to be capped. So it's not like they're launched and that's the only time they can perform cap. They could actually fly to another ship and perform cap on that one if they're not capable of sending out their own fighters for some odd reason. Either they're not equipped with them or they lose the ability to use them. And when an attack craft is performing cap, the following rules apply. They move with the vessel, and that's it. They will not move in their ordnance phase, so they don't get a double move. They are, however, allowed to move in the opponent's movement phase, ordnance phase. However, that's only if, in their movement phase, the ship they're escorting doesn't go further than their maximum move. So, for example, if you have a Thunderhawk doing cap on, say, a Cobra escort, Thunderhawks have a movement speed of 20 centimeters, and the Cobra has 30 centimeter movement range. If the Cobra moves 30 centimeters, then the Thunderhawk is not allowed to do any form of movement in its ordnance phase and the opponent's ordnance phase. If the Cobra only moves 20, it has to stay still during your ordnance phase, but in your opponent's ordnance phase, it can break away if it wants to. And this function can only be done if the fighter has the fighter type. So you can't have a bomber or an assault boat performing cap unless it also counts as a fighter. So it's not like you can have it join up with a ship and then run the ship into an enemy vessel and then go, haha, my bomber's now to attack because they're in base contact. And the reason I bring that up is because technically you can do that if the fighter is a fighter/bomber/assault boat attack craft. So if you have them capping on a vessel and that vessel rams another ship or performs a boarding action on another ship or just happens to come into contact with another ship, in your ordnance phase, those fighters performing cap may trigger and use their other functionality to perform an attack on the enemy vessel. So like in this example here, we've got a Gothic class cruiser and it's got some Thunderhawks protecting it. The Gothic class cruiser moves in to base contact with this Chaos vessel, and so once it's the time for the ordnance phase, those Thunderhawks can now perform their attack runs on the Chaos cruiser if they wish to. Now, in cases where you have fighters in a wave mixed with bombers and assault boats, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and they come into contact with a friendly vessel, the fighters in that wave can break away from the wave to perform cap on the ship, while the rest of the wave continues moving forward. And in general, there are only 2 times where a ship can exit cap from a vessel aside from getting destroyed. The first is in your movement phase, you can declare that they're no longer going to be cap, then the ship moves, the ordnance stays where it is, and then moves in your ordnance phase. Or during an opponent's ordnance phase, when it's your time to move, you can say these ships break off. And one note before I forget again, in scenarios where you run across blast markers, each of the fighters attached to a ship counts as an individual squad. So if you have 3 and you move past a blast marker, you have to roll 3d6 to see if any of the fighters escorting your vessel get destroyed. And it is possible for fighters in cap to defend ordnance that are hiding in a ship's base. So just for an example, if you have a ship with a bunch of fighters protecting it, and then a bomber marker goes onto its base, and an enemy fighter comes in to intercept that bomber, the fighters screening are allowed to intercept that enemy fighter. However, as a note, in these situations when the enemy ordnance is there to attack a friendly ordnance hiding in the base of a ship, turrets cannot be used against that ordnance because the attack craft isn't attacking the ship, it's attacking the other attack craft hiding in the ship's base. The only defense it gets is if there's any fighters performing cap on the vessel. And in scenarios where you have a resilient craft, that's a craft with a 4+ save, which we'll get into a little bit later, that save, one of the things about that rule is when they make a save, if they pass it, they stop moving immediately, and that's it. In those scenarios where they're trying to attack a ship that has fighters performing cap, if, because of just how the scenario goes, the ship makes contact with the marker of the fighter first, and the fighter intercepts it, you roll your save and you're good. If that ship would have made contact with the ship's base, if that attack craft would have made contact with the ship's base, it still does so. That's not a way to stop it from getting to the ship. It's not a, haha, you technically are 20 millimeters away from the vessel, so you can't do your bombing run now. It would have gotten into base contact with the ship if that marker wasn't there, so it still gets to perform its attack. The next type of attack craft are bombers. These are slightly larger but slower aircraft that are designed to fly in, get in close to an enemy ship, and drop some sort of bomb that does devastating damage to the ship. These guys can be really nasty if they can get their attack runs off because of the fact that they go through shields. Really bad stuff. And they have the following rules that apply to them. If they come into contact with a fighter token, then the fighters come in, take advantage of their speed, destroy the bomber squadron, and both tokens are removed from play. If they come into contact with any other ordnance type, then they manage to get around each other and avoid each other, avoid making contact, and both tokens stay in play. If they come in contact with an enemy ship, then they perform what's called an attack run. You would take a d6 for every squadron that managed to make contact with the enemy vessel and roll it, minusing the ship's turret value from the result. And what you get is how many attacks the bomber squadron gets to do. Now keep in mind, if the ship in question had fired its turrets against torpedoes, it still applies this negative modifier. Attacking torpedoes does not negate its turret's ability to negate from the dice roll. This is to represent the bombers actively trying to avoid any turret fire, even if it's not aimed at them, while they're making their attack run. And as noted when we talked about massing turrets, the massing turrets bonus does not get applied to this modifier. So if a ship has 2 turrets and there's 2 ships in base contact with it, it's not a -4, it's a -2. Once that's done, that's how many attacks you get, and you roll d6s against the target's lowest armor value. So it doesn't matter which direction the bombers came from, it always goes against the target's lowest armor value. And for every successful hit, it deals damage. And with this, there is one final rule that's used with bombers, and that's turret suppression. This comes into play when a bomber has any kind of fighter escort with it. They make contact with the ship. The fighters not only will take damage from turrets first, they also add a bonus to the bomber's attack run. So if you have a wave of 3 bombers and 3 fighters, they go into attack. They get each bomber, after you do all of your dice rolls to determine how many attacks the bombers get, you then add an additional 3 for the 3 fighters. It doesn't matter if the fighters get destroyed by turrets, this bonus is still applied. There's only 2 ways that they do not apply their bonus. First is if the ship was protected by any fighters performing cap. If they manage to negate out a fighter, then that fighter isn't applied when the ship is determining how many attacks they get. And it's all based on how many bombers survive. So it doesn't matter if the fighters all get completely destroyed, what matters is how many bombers survive. So like in our scenario, we have 3 bombers, 3 fighters. They go in, the ship has no cap on it. The turrets go off, all 3 fighters get destroyed. The bombers roll 3d6s minus the turret value of the ship, and then add 3 because there were 3 fighters in the squadron. If it ends up going, the wave goes in, 3 fighters and 2 bombers get destroyed, then it can only get an additional +1 added to its total value because only 1 bomber squadron survived. So here's an example of this in play. We got ourselves a vessel getting attacked by a wave of 3 bombers and 3 fighters. The wave goes in and the turrets go off and destroys all 3 fighters. The bombers then roll a d6 and minus 3 from its value because the ship had a turret value of 3. And you combine those all together and you get your final value. But then you apply a +3, 1 for each of those fighters, because even though they got destroyed, they were still part of the wave. Now let's take this scenario again, but now let's add a fighter squadron protecting the vessel. The ships move in, the fighter patrol craft destroys one of the fighters in the wave, and the whole scenario goes through again. Both fighters were destroyed, but the bombers survived. They roll their d6s, minus 3 from the turrets, and instead of +3, because there were 3 fighters in the squadron, they only do +2, because one of those fighters was destroyed before they made their attack on the vessel. So now let's do one final example. This time there are 2 ships in base contact with the target vessel. The Strength 6 wave attacks the ship and manages to destroy all 3 fighters and 2 of the bombers. So only 1 bomber survives. It rolls a d6, minuses 3 because it only takes the value of the ship it's attacking's turrets into effect, and then only adds +1 because even though there were 3 fighters, only 1 bomber squadron survived. The next type of attack craft are torpedo bombers. These are bombers that, instead of being given this large bomb that they drop, are fitted with a small anti-ship missile that takes aim and fires. Just like any other form of attack craft, they're represented by a 20 by 20 millimeter square base, and you place it down and you launch it and move it forward. In subsequent turns, you can't do this to turn that they are launched, you may convert them into a Strength 2 torpedo salvo, which then moves forward, typically 20 centimeters because that's the typical range of a bomber. And then if they hit something, and if they don't hit something, they're removed from play afterwards because they have such a limited fuel on them. Now, there is a bit of a debate over this one question about this rule. Can you pick the direction the torpedoes are going when you convert them, or must they go in the direction the marker was facing? Now, the way I interpret this rule, it says at the beginning of the ordnance phase, you can choose to convert them. That tells me that they must go in the direction that the ordnance is facing because it's done before they move. The other side of the argument is that you can turn them because the bombers would lock themselves into position and then fire their torpedoes. And that makes them more versatile and more useful because if you had to fire them in the direction they're facing, there's a risk they don't hit anything. But my mindset is you're going to know if they're going to hit something before you convert them, since you only have one chance, and if you miss it, you miss it. So my thought is they must face the direction that the token is facing. But other people believe that you can turn and face them however you want. However you decide to do this, just make sure that your opponent is on board with your interpretation of this rule. And feel free to leave a comment discussing this further if you'd like. But regardless, you convert it into a strength 2 torpedo salvo, it moves, and then at the end of your turn, ordnance phase, it gets removed. And if you have a wave of torpedo bombers, you're allowed to convert and combine their strengths together into one large salvo if you wish. And as I mentioned, you can't do this on the turn they're launched. So if they happen to run into a target when they're launched, they are then treated like regular bombers. Essentially, so they do the whole bombing run, attack run, and all that jazz. But in any other turn after the turn they're launched, if you want, you can convert them into torpedoes. The next type of attack craft, which is our final one we're going to be talking about, is assault boats. Assault boats are basically, think of the assault ram ship from Space Marines, or if you guys have watched the short video Space Marines, the ship that when they're going to land on the enemy vessel and they just bore right into it and drop their assault rams and the Space Marines come out, that's basically an assault boat. It's a ship designed to ram into the side of another vessel, and then it uses like a series of melta-like devices to cut a hole to allow them to unload armored troops into the ship to cause mass damage as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And they have the following rules applied to them. When they come into contact with fighter markers, the fighters manage to overwhelm them and destroy them, so you would remove both markers from play. If they come into contact with another ordnance that's not a fighter, they manage to avoid each other and you keep both markers in play. Against an enemy vessel, assuming that they've gotten past any fighters performing cap and have managed to survive the turret attacks, they then perform a hit and run attack. This is a special kind of attack that typically happens in the end phase, but because these are an ordnance marker, it instead happens in the ordnance phase. So for right now, we're going to put that right there, and we'll discuss how the hit and run attacks are done in the next video, which is going to be about the end phase. So for right now, you just have to know that when assault boats make contact with an enemy ship, that's when you get to perform a hit and run. So when you are launching your attack squadrons, you have the option to either launch them as individuals or as a wave. So if you've got a ship that has 4 launch bays and it's got fighters and bombers, you can launch them as either individual squadrons or a giant wave combined with different combinations. So 2 bombers, 2 fighters, 3 fighters, 1 bomber, however you want to do it, as long as it has the different ship options that you're looking for. But when you create these waves, you have to have the tokens touching each other in the smallest configuration possible. So, for example, this would be a wave of 2, a wave of 3, a wave of 4, a wave of 6. You essentially can't try and daisy chain to make these really long lines of attack craft. You have to cram it down into the smallest footprint possible. And they all move together as a single squadron, and when they come in contact with fighters or getting attacked by turrets, the fighters in the wave are removed first. Basically, you're protecting your bombers by giving up the fighters first, which is what the benefit of the wave is. The other benefit of the wave is there's only one turret attack against the squadron. If you fire them as individuals, the turrets get to attack individually to each squadron that attacks them. But as a wave, it's only one attack for the entire squadron, giving you a higher chance that you're going to get attacks through. The biggest downside to an attack wave is that when they're hit by direct fire weaponry, or if they run over a blast marker, the whole squadron gets wiped out with a single hit. It's not one for each, so that's the biggest downside. And on top of that, if they manage to destroy a vessel before all of the ships get to do their attack, the whole wave is removed. You don't get to keep. So if it was destroyed after the third attack, you don't get to keep the other remaining 3 in a wave of 6. The whole wave goes away. With that, waves are allowed to break apart during their movement in the ordnance phase. So if you have a wave of 3 fighters, 3 bombers, you're going towards a ship, and a new wave of torpedoes has just come onto the field and you want to get rid of them, you can break your fighters off from the wave and have them attack the torpedoes while your bombers continue on with the original target. However, if they break up in this way, they cannot reform into a wave. Waves can only be formed when they're launched from their vessels. The last thing we're going to be talking about in this video is resilient attack craft. These are vessels that either have really thick armor plating, making it harder to destroy them, or they're really fast and nimble, making them harder to hit. And in the game, this is represented by giving them a 4+ save against ordnance interactions. If the resilient craft comes into contact with an ordnance that would normally remove it from the game, you roll a d6, and on a 4+, they stay in play. However, they can not do any more movement that turn. So if they interact with something at 10 centimeters, they roll and they save, but they can still move another 10 centimeters. Not anymore, they now have to stay in place. The only exception to this is if they're performing cap, because the ship is moving them instead. Now, regardless of if this save was used in the movement phase for fighters that are performing cap or in the ordnance phase, once the save is used, you can't use it again until the following turn. Any attack craft that performs a resilience save and ends its move in contact with a ship can still perform their attack runs on it. So a Thunderhawk that comes into contact with a ship and there was vessels performing cap on it and it rolls for its resilience save, as long as it passed it, it can still make its attack. The resilient roll doesn't stop it from doing its attack run. And speaking about Thunderhawks, attack craft that have a dual function, fighter and something else, like Thunderhawks are fighter and assault boats, they must perform their fighter function even if you don't want them to. So it is possible that they can waste their resilience save on a attack craft that they didn't intend to use it on, because it still functions as a fighter even when you don't want it to. In cases of when they don't do a dual function, like a Tau Manta, that's just a bomber, it's not a bomber and a fighter, if it comes in contact with an ordnance token it normally just ignores, then it doesn't need to use its save, because it wouldn't be destroyed regardless of if it had the save or not. If a second interaction occurs in the same ordnance phase, such as attacking multiple markers, the resilient craft is removed from play as if it was a normal fighter without a resilience save. However, in these scenarios, the attacking player always decides the order of interaction. So, in this example here, we've got 2 Thunderhawks that are going to come in contact with 2 Barracudas. Thunderhawk A is going to attack and destroy Barracuda A. It then makes its resilience save and passes it. Now, the Space Marine player decides that Thunderhawk A is now going to attack Barracuda B. This destroys both attack craft because the Thunderhawk no longer has its save. But this allows Thunderhawk B to move forward as if the interaction didn't happen because it never used its save. In cases where both attack crafts are resilient, you would roll your d6s, and if both pass, both markers stay on the field and remain in play, and then the next movement phase they break apart from each other. If another Ordnance marker comes into contact with them after this in the same phase, then they would be removed as if they were normal fighters. And in cases of resilient attack craft in a wave of non-resilient craft, if they come into contact with something that would trigger the resilient craft save, then there's 2 options. Either the whole wave stays in place and they stop moving, or the vessels that aren't resilient break away and continue their movement while the resilient craft stays where they were. And that is it for this video. We've gone over quite a few bits of information here, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. I will try to answer them as fast as I can. And again, if we get too many of these questions, I'll put up an FAQ video that answers all of them in one go. And so all we have left to talk about is the end phase, squadrons, and terrain effects. Once that's all done, we will then do a playthrough of a single round of Battlefleet Gothic so you can see all these rules in practice. So, that is all for right now. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, fearless gamers, take care.